So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just answer the question, like, what is a roundtable presentation? And so you'll see on this image on the right, it's very much like wedding reception style conversation, but for research and nerds like us. So you can see that it gets its name from these big round tables, which host multiple presenters at each table. And so in a room at AERA, it'll be really big, somewhere upwards of like 20 to 30 tables, all with 3 to 5 presenters within each table, all sort of talking about the same topic. Now, I looked up the specs on what to actually expect from AERA. So these are 90-minute sessions, and at each table, there are going to be about 3 to 5 presenters. In addition to those presenters at the table, you'll typically have a facilitator who will help with timing, who you can go to if something's wrong or you can't find your place or you need some help with anything. And then you'll also have your audience members sort of sitting at the table with you or sort of crowding around the table to kind of listen into your presentation. And what's really cool about roundtables is that the presentation style can be really flexible. I think sometimes this can be anxiety provoking, but in another way, it means that you get to present your work in the way that you think will be the best mode to present in. And so whether that's actually doing a handout or doing a script or maybe providing a video or sorry for my dog, or any kind of presentation, whatever feels right for your work, you can actually use that to your advantage here. Now, there are some pros and cons to a roundtable presentation, and I'll talk about the pros first. So first of all, there's a lot of presentations going on in one space, and that's the unique aspect of roundtable presentations. If you think about a 90-minute paper session, you can typically only fit about 4 to 5 presenters, whereas in a roundtable, you can have almost hundreds of presenters in the same room at the same time. So that's really cool. A lot of research is happening in one space. Again, I talked about the flexibility in your presentation styles and the opportunity that you get to really cater your presentation to your work. Another interesting thing about roundtables is, unlike poster presentations, which can be really broad, so maybe there's a huge poster session on just motivation in general, you get to be at a table with people who are also interested in your specific topic. So say you do research on motivation, but specifically on high school students' motivation. So you might be at a table with other researchers who specifically study high school motivation or things of that nature. And so this is a little bit better than a poster session because you're not getting those broad, huge rooms, and you really get a smaller space to really discuss those topics in depth. And so that's really helpful. And it's also not so much like a poster presentation where people are just passing by to speak to you for 2 to 3 minutes, but you have people actively engaged at your table, ready to hear your presentation in full and have an in-depth discussion. Now, with these pros comes some cons with the roundtable, and I think this is what makes roundtables a little bit scary for some people. So first of all, there are some definite unknowns and expectations about the structure of what your presentation style can look like. Of course, you can use that to your advantage, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but those unknowns can be anxiety producing. And then second con is the room can be really loud. If you think of like a wedding reception, those can get really loud. And so if you have limited space, you have limited visual aids, it can get kind of tricky to work around those. And so we have some tips prepared for how to navigate those difficulties. So next we'll move on to the session about preparing and presenting your research. And so I think there are 4 things to keep in mind when you're preparing for a roundtable discussion. Now, some of these tips will overlap with just presenting in general, but I think they'll be really crucial for roundtables specifically as well. So first of all, I want you to think about the purpose of your presentation. So not really the purpose of your study or why you did the research, but why are you at AERA and what do you want to get out of this presentation? So there are a lot of different examples and they have some implications for what you might do in your presentation to cater towards that goal. So for example, if you want to share your work with other researchers, and that's a big goal of yours, then you want to make sure that you emphasize how your work informs other people's work. Or if you are really keen on making sure that your work reaches educational practitioners or teachers, then you want to make sure that you're using familiar terms that they're used to, or emphasizing the practical implications of your work. So as you reflect on, why am I here? What's the reason of my presentation? You can prepare and cater your presentation to meet that goal. The second thing I want to talk about is timing and structure, because again, there are a lot of unknowns. And so some tips to get around some of those unknowns. First of all, depending on the number of presenters at your table, kind of dictates how much time you have. So if you have 3 presenters, you might have 20 to 30 minutes, but if you have upwards of 5 or 6 presenters, you have even less time. And so you have to sort of prepare for all those kind of time intervals. The second is what the structure is going to be like. So does presenter A go first, then B, then C, and then have a general discussion? Or is presenter A going first and then discussing, and then presenter B's going and then discussing, etc.? Or is it kind of a mix of both? Is everyone presenting at the same time and then just discussing with whoever's next to them at the table? These things can really vary. And so the first thing I want you to do as you're preparing for your roundtable is to check your program. Just kind of get an idea of who's going to be at your table if you can, and how many presenters there are going to be. And so that can kind of give you a judge of how much time do you have to present. The second thing you can do is actually reach out to your facilitator in advance and ask them what are their expectations for what this roundtable should look like. And if they don't have specific expectations, you might even suggest a structure to say, hey, I'm preparing for a 5-minute discussion and then question and answer right after, or I would like to go first, or something like that. You can also bring this up at the table a few minutes before your presentation if you get there early, and you can, sort of negotiate with the other presenters to say, hey, I prepared this. Is this feasible? I can work around, etc. But, it's all about the flexibility and trying to make sure that you're being mindful of other people's time and your own time, but also like making sure that you can convey the message that you want to convey in that time. Okay, so the third thing that I'd like to talk about is presentation format, because it's a little different than a poster, because you're not giving a full-on presentation, 20-minute presentation on your work. And you also have to keep in mind that you really want those discussions. It's not just a presentation, it's a roundtable discussion. And so the norms around this are typically a 5 to 8 minute like verbal talk about what you're presenting. And as we talked about, the room can get really loud and really crowded. And so something that can really help with those talks is having some sort of visual aid. Now, you're not going to have the opportunity to have a big PowerPoint on a big screen and flip through slides in front of people, but you can use other techniques, like maybe having a QR code ready so people can see a presentation online, or having a video at the ready so you can show people on your laptop and sort of pass the laptop around. That's been really common at past roundtables that I've been in. Or something that I really like to do is provide a handout for people. So I'm giving a script of what I'm talking about and, presenting my work, but also for people way across the room or way across the table who can't quite hear me, they at least have some kind of visual handout of what I'm saying generally. And so they can still be as engaged as possible if they can't hear every single word I'm saying. I also have left some examples on this slide, and we can share these after the presentation today so that you can use those and sort of use them to your advantage. With this presentation, it's basically the same thing that we all know. You want to cover the basics, right? So the basics are introduction to your topic. What's the purpose of your study? What are your research questions? What kinds of methods did you use, and who are your participants? And then, of course, what are the main results and what are the key takeaways that you want people to leave the room with? This is not very different from a paper presentation or even the abstract that you use to submit, but you just want to make sure that you're covering all those basics while also keeping in mind the timing, the room setup, and the structure, and the limited visual aids that you'll have. So on this slide, I have my presentation handout from last year, and you can see very clearly that I have each aspect of that presentation kind of covered in my handout. So at a quick glance, you can see the introduction, you can see the purpose of my study and what my questions were. You can look and see what methods I used. And then I have a huge section of like, what do I want people to take away from this topic? So using those visual aids to your advantage can be really helpful to make sure that everyone gets the basics and the core of the message that you're trying to give off. All right. And I also wanted to touch a little bit on visual aids because I think that this is a really, really helpful tool for those roundtable discussions. And so, first of all, it doesn't have to be fancy. I like to make mine pretty because I think that aesthetics help. And I think they do help in like drawing attention. People can see your handout and say like, oh, this looks interesting. Oh, it immediately captures my eye. And something else that's really helpful is that people can walk away with these handouts and they can look at them later on. So maybe they don't have time to sit and hear your full talk, but they might be able to take that sheet of paper to their room later that night and read about it or learn about your work at a later time after the conference or after the presentation. So you don't want these to be super text heavy. You don't want it to just be a document full of text that just feels overwhelming. You want to cover the basics and make sure it's readable. And so something that will help with that is being succinct. So as you can see in my introduction, this is just 2 sentences, 2-sentence definition of what is belonging-centered instruction. Just a paragraph of what my method was. Of course, this is not a lot of detail, but I'm getting the basics across so that people can get the core of my study and ask questions based on that. And then also something that will help is using section headers to like break up each piece. And so it's not just this huge glob of text that I have to read and sort of look for what your research questions were. I can see them immediately at the forefront. And then something else that people don't think about is it's not like a poster session where it's like pasted on a wall, and you can actually use the backside of the sheet too. So for me, I knew that my method wasn't really in depth and that people might really want more detail about the method. And so I used the backside of my sheet to really go in depth and give people that bonus information in case they want it. The last thing I want you all to consider as you're thinking about you're preparing your roundtable presentation is really just keeping your audience in mind. So keeping in mind the limitations of the structure in the room, keeping in mind that you're going to have limited time and how your audience might perceive those things. So the first thing is think about the common questions that might come up. So what questions are people typically asking at conferences? And what questions have you been getting whenever you're getting feedback from your peers and colleagues about your work? And then prepare some answers for those questions. So if you think that a lot of people are really interested in your method, make sure that you have sort of an answer to describe it in more detail if someone isn't quite catching it on the first pass of your presentation. Something else that will help with that is just reflect on what you're leaving out in your really short presentation. So for example, I might not have time in my 5 to 8 minute script to detail all the measures that I used and all the items that I used in my presentation. And so I might have those at the ready so that I can pull them up and show someone who might ask later. Or I might put that on the back of my handout so that they can see it later. Something else that will help is just practicing a lot. So, and not just with your colleagues or people in your lab, but people who are a little bit unfamiliar with your work. So practicing with friends or family members, maybe a teacher that you know who doesn't really know what kind of research you're doing, or practicing with someone else in your department that is not quite doing the same work that you're doing, so you can get feedback from a diverse audience. If you think about who's going to be at AERA, it's not all going to be people who study motivation in this specific way. And so you want to make sure that all the information that you're giving is accessible to those people as well. And it'll also give you a chance to see what the common questions are and sort of like test your presentation on them. And then aside from practicing with other people, you can also record yourself and practice. So you can watch yourself play it, you know, record yourself on Zoom, play the video back. So you can pick up on like, oh, like I didn't really talk about this and I think that should be talked about. So I'm going to make sure I incorporate that. Or, oh, I have a lot of word fillers and I use and like a lot. So I should maybe practice taking those out. So those are just some tips. It can be really cringy to watch yourself, but it can be really helpful as well. And then finally, you're going to get questions. And I think questions are things that are really scary to graduate students when they're getting asked about their study. So when you get a question in the moment, I want you to pause and actually interpret the question before you open your mouth and give an answer, because it's really easy to come up with some, you know, BS answer in the moment that is like, I don't know if I really meant to say that, or I don't even know what I said. So just take a breath, interpret the question in your head, or what might even be helpful is repeating the question back to the audience. So saying, oh, my understanding is that you have a question about XYZ, and here's my answer to that. But having that pause and interpreting the question and making sure you understand it so you can give a good answer will be critical. And then finally, there's not always an answer to the questions that are asked at AERA. And so if you don't know an answer to the question, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know the answer to that question. And you can phrase this very differently and say, you know, that's an interesting question. I'd love to look into that further, or I don't have data on that, but I think that'd be a really interesting insight. Depending on the questions you get, you don't have to just be like, I don't know, bye. You can actually reflect on, you know, what they're saying, take that information as like feedback, or maybe even follow up with them with a more in-depth discussion of like, oh yeah, here's how I could do that or answer that question before. Okay. So I think that's all I had for the key tips in preparing and presenting. And of course, I'll answer some questions more towards the end of our presentation today. But Yuchen is now going to talk about what it's like to attend and how to network at these events.
Thank you, Yin. Those are all very wonderful suggestions. I feel like I learned a lot, even though I'm on the panel. So thank you for that. Would you mind changing slides when we need to change slides? Okay. All right. Share. 1 second. Are you able to see it? And if I are you seeing the full slide? Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'll be talking about how to be a good attendees and how to get the most out of each session as attendees. I want to keep this short and sweet because we do have an activity afterward. So stay tuned. The first tip I would say is to be engaged, but not perfectionistic. Because as I recall, you know, a lot of, I mean, even for myself at this particular moment, you know, but this is more pronounced in my first and second year. You know, I was really excited going into these conferences, you know, either it's AERA or SRCD, because when you look at the program, you saw names that you be reading, you know, you saw names that you've been citing. So it almost feels like meeting with a celebrity to some extent. So it can be really nerve-wracking. You know, you want to get the most out of those conferences. You want to be like engaged 100% all the time, like 24/7 throughout the conference week. But one thing I do want to emphasize here is that there is going to be a lot of stuff that you may not understand from the presentation, and that is totally okay. I totally understand that, we want to get most out of those presentations, but one of our goal, don't forget, one of our goal going into the conference in the first place is to learn something that we haven't had any idea about. So be engaged, stay focused, but don't try to be perfectionist. And this kind of relates to my next point, which is stay active, but not interruptive. What I mean by stay active is that during those sessions, you don't want to just be a quiet attendee. I'm not here to talk about, how to be a good attendee, because I'm assuming all of us know how to be a good attendee. But what I'm really saying here is to, when you're listening to those presentations or, roundtable presentations, keep thinking about how it relates to your project. Keep thinking about, what are some methodology that you might want to apply to your own studies, and what are even some methodological weaknesses that you want to raise as a question later on after the presentation is over. So stay active, thinking about those questions, or think about the implications of the study. How, what kind of message does this study bring to teachers, to parents, or to students, right? Stay active, but not interruptive. I know that the roundtable session can be a little bit more informal compared to a presentation session or a paper session, but I still want to be, respectful to the presenter. It's not like you are in the theater watching a movie and you don't like the movie. You're like, I don't like it. I'm bored. I'll just leave. That's not okay. You don't want to leave when the presenter is still talking. At least, give them a heads up, give your group a heads up, I'm going to move around tables and I want to check other things out. So stay active, don't be, interruptive. And when you ask those questions after the presentation, when you ask those questions, I do want to emphasize a point that you want to keep your questions reasonable. Because during conferences, this is a lot of researchers meet, we had conversation, we have discussion on each other's project. You really want to draw the line as to what is a reasonable question. Let me explain it a little bit. So I've seen people in conference where they started with a question related to the presenter's project, but as the discussion evolves, as discussion goes on, they start to relate it more and more to the audience's research interest. You really want to keep the boundary within the presenter's expertise, because they are the presenters. They are here to talk about their project instead of it's not their job to provide super constructive feedback to your study, because they are not as familiar with your study as yourself, and you are not as familiar as as their project as themselves. So keep that in mind. Don't try to be I would say, don't try to digress from what the presenter has to say. And yeah, I think I just covered the second and third point pretty much. Choose your lane, but be respectful. Okay, and I want to share a little bit about networking in conference and in roundtable session. Like I mentioned, I think I have alluded to this point a little bit in my previous point, but you want the discussion to evolve into a conversation. You want to exchange ideas instead of just one person talking to the other, without a pause. I feel like it's always most productive when I am both the speaker and the listener. Again, how do we learn from other people at conference? We hear what other people have to say. right? If we just keep talking, we don't learn anything from the other person. We're just simply, giving output of what we've been doing. And after the session, I would really recommend, share your contact information if you're really interested in the project they are talking about during the session. This will give you a chance to reach out if you have something you want to collaborate with, or even if you run into a problem or a question in your future studies that you want to consult for advice. This would be a really, really good avenue. And a lot of this conversation during the roundtable session actually happened pretty quickly. It's not like you guys have an hour talk to each other individually in depth. So a lot of times people will ask you like, oh, I'm glad you're interested in my project. So what's your research? What's your research is all about? And this is when you want to have your 1 minute elevator pitch of your own research project to be prepared. So when that question comes up, you'll be ready to answer it. And with that 1 minute elevator pitch, one thing I want to bring up is, you can structure it as usual, like this is my research question, this is how I study it, this is what I find. That is totally fine. But at least emphasize something that distinguish your study from other studies. Give the presenter or give the other person something to remember about your project. Maybe people in your field, they usually study the topic using self-report, but your study involves, observational method. That's a number for people to remember. Or something like, some people use, say, parents report, and you are using like ESM. That's another like point for memorization. I hope I'm making myself clear. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and another question that comes up very often is, are you going to present at some point, right, during the conference, and you want to have that answer prepared as well? Or even if the other person didn't raise the question, you can still just tell them directly, I'm presenting on this date, and if you're interested, you can feel free to join. And I want to circle back to a point that Yin just discussed early on. The room is really loud. It's nowhere near a paper session. So a lot of times, I think we have a couple international students on the call. When English is not your first language, it's really tough. I find myself, a lot of times in those loud rooms, they not only really apply just to roundtable session, these apply to our business event, SIG event, things like that. There are just way too many people to hear what the other person was saying. I feel like a lot of times I would just keep my eyes wide open and like, okay, I can capture a couple of words, and based on their intonation, I can capture basically what they're trying to say. But it's hard to have really meaningful conversation about your research, about the other person's research within that kind of environment. You can have a good conversation, but chances are you won't have a in-depth conversation, if that makes sense. So, it's okay to ask people out for lunch, ask people, if you are too shy to go for lunch, you can go for coffee, or you can, attend a session together because you guys share the same research interest. Those are all, method of networking during a conference that I find really helpful. Actually, last year, I presented my research in progress session at Division C. And another graduate student who's more senior than me, he had a lot of great advice for the study that I was about to launch. And we basically just grab a cup of coffee right after the session. So where we have a lot more in-depth and meaningful conversation about the study. So yeah, and you're almost there. And after the conference, don't forget to send a follow-up email. I'm really happy to meet you at the conference. Hopefully, we can talk again about research sometime down the line. Those are very, very important as well. Yeah, and make sure to follow them on Twitter, because the Motivation Sick is a really active group on Twitter. So if you don't have a Twitter, register today. If you haven't followed the Motivation Sick, follow today. All right. And with our activity, I would like to break our participant into the room of 2 to 3. And within the breakout room, people can share their 1-minute elevator pitch that I just talked about. This can be on any topic. This doesn't have to be research, but if you like, you have been too primed to not talk about your research, it's totally fine. So, on the right side of the slide, there are some instruction, there are some prompts that you can think about when you are brainstorming about your elevator pitch, and like what kind of feedback you might expect to give to others. Does everything sounds good? Okay, Corey, how do you make a breakout room?
Thank you. I'm working on it right now. And then it might be helpful if you could copy and paste. Well, there's not that much on here. Maybe we can remember. If you're able to copy and paste it in the chat for the breakout rooms, that might be helpful, but I'm about to open them for everyone.
Just copied them and pasted them into the chat more generally. So hopefully it stays there as people move to rooms.
Perfect.
But if
Thank
not,
you.
I can send it along too.
No, I think that will work. I was looking at the breakout rooms, but I'll go ahead and open them. And yeah, I'll open this. All right. So if you should be able to see the breakout rooms popped up. If you don't, just let me know and then I can help move people into breakout rooms. Perfect. And then how long, I'm sorry if you said this, how long do you want the breakout rooms open for?
Probably let's start with 10. How that sound? Ian?
I think we were thinking like 10 minutes so we could still have
Yeah.
time for Q&A.
Yep.
After.
Should I set myself a timer to remember? Oh,
I might hop in and out of some rooms.
sounds good. See you all soon.
Okay.